So the seminar is called Axiomatic Earth. Axiomatic Earth describes a condition, or what we identify as a condition, whereby the Earth itself and everything within it is increasingly captured by systems of abstraction. By systems of abstraction, I mean something like processes of classification in which, in most cases, let's say you deploy technoscience instrumentally within that, but not only through technoscience. Systems of classification, systems of organization, abstraction. So a certain kind of knowledge is produced over the Earth that allows it to be mobilized and made operational in certain terms. So you find this, for instance, from genomics to climatic science, going through finance, going through resource extraction, mental health, management, let's say. So we call this the axiomatic Earth. And the reason that we decided to speak and introduce this idea of the axiomatic Earth in the context of a conversation about the Anthropocene at large and the technosphere in specific is that it allows us to bring capitalism into the conversation, i.e. the most aggressive and the most competent machine that deploys abstraction in its own mode of functioning and that allows it to actually accelerate in those terms is capitalism, obviously. So capitalism is something that you cannot disconnect from the conversation about the technosphere, that you cannot naturalize in our perspective. In order to do so, these conversations about classification, or let's say this problem of classification and abstraction, in our view what it allows is to think about specific disputes. Disputes about how you measure, how you count. Even before you're discussing the content of what you're counting, you have to discuss how you count. How do you deploy processes of counting, of measuring, of non-measuring, so on and so forth. So this is more or less the topic and the thematic of the seminar. So when you think about how you count, immediately you force into visibility a series of political claims, a series of social claims, environmental claims, but also affective claims. And not going too much into the direction of what I expect other questions will be, but let's say we try to focus from the start in how we set it up in the idea of the case study. The idea of the case study in itself, conceptually, academically, is very problematic. But leaving that aside for the moment, we try to have this conversation not through endless discussions about what is the technosphere of the Anthropocene and this overarching concepts, to which have a whole family of competing overarching concepts. But on the other way around, how can we think the technosphere by looking at specific disputes? At the moment where the classification and measurement of the viscosity of heavy oil allows to construct radical mutations in political territorial systems, for instance. Things like this. This is, let's say, the way that we frame the seminar. Let's say, if you take this through, the idea of dispute and classification and so on, what it raises in relation to how the technosphere, not only is it constructed as a, let's say, conceptual framework, apparatus, but in the way that it circulates, particularly in relation to conversations of the Anthropocene. It tends to be constructed and framed in relation to a certain understanding of scale, which is, let's say, the technosphere is a large-scale machine. Well, scale is a very specific thing in relation to the question that you ask of the problematic. And it's something actually that cuts across the different works that all the members, let's say, that are organizing this, so me, Susanna, Adrian, Matteo, and Susan, cuts across our works in a very specific way. And it's as following. We focus on disputes and we focus, let's say, on these cases because each of them, if you imagine, for instance, as I was saying, let's say a different example, dispute about biopiracy in India or in Ecuador. It brings together religious processes that have a very specific scale that you cannot measure, at least not with the same way of measuring that you measure deforestation that you use as a consequence of patenting a specific genome, for instance, for medicine. it enters into questions, for instance, of local politics, municipal politics, nation-state politics, traditional politics, emancipatory social movements politics. I was mentioning Ecuador, for instance. It introduces questions that have to do with geography, with climate. The way that you visualize deforestation requires satellite. So suddenly you say, oh, it's multiscalar. Yes, to a certain extent, yeah, sure. But we prefer to say that each dispute constitutes its own scale, i.e., it brings together kind of a forum of constituent participant elements, and it requires a specific mode of knowledge production, to which all the words that we constantly deploy, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, intradisciplinary, transdisciplinary, so on and so forth, are approximations to bad approximations towards actually a different thing, which is each dispute organizes a forum, reorganizes priorities, reorganizes alliances. So what does this allow us to say? That the problematic that we're addressing, first and foremost, is one of the concept of scale. I.e., that's what we throw through the axiomatic earth, a very political concept of scale that we throw back at the construction of the technosphere. Two of the participants, me and Adrian, were here in the previous campus doing the geopolitics seminar. And in there we did, part of it was a bit more traditional. Discussion, roundtable, and discussion of the concepts, etc. Now, what we find immediately once you get here is that first, the HKV is a big networking machine of people that have spent a lot of years thinking about this, most of them. I.e., if you want to discuss these concepts properly, you go and write a book and read an essay. What was replied to us, actually, what people found more interesting, was the little machines that we invented for the seminar. So we had this thing called conceptual speed dating, which I won't take the time to explain here, but it's suggestive as name. We had roundtables. It's the machines that allowed certain kinds of exchanges to take place, were for us what was more interesting. So this year we decided to experiment on one thing called the grid. And the idea is, how do we set up the seminar in a way, instead of we arguing a certain claim about the technosphere, I don't think we're here for that. How do we make the claim implicit to the format of the seminar so that we don't have to argue it? At least not extensively, or to put it more correctly, so that it allows a different kind of discussion to emerge. So the first thing, of course, I already mentioned, we organize a seminar according to a series of 5 case study presentations. So we start by the dispute and not by the concept, in which then you deploy concepts. But at the same time, during each conversation, we set up groups of monitors, groups of 4 people that are in there classifying the conversation, so sitting at the ends of tables. Each of them have the responsibility to invent a system of classification and how to classify it. We call this the grid. So they might classify frequency of certain terms. They might classify gender relations. They might classify why the people from the left-hand side of the table were speaking more. Maybe because the speaker was on the left-hand side and they listened better. You know, they might classify things that you normally don't enter the conversation. Now, what these classifications allow then is 2 things. A, to understand how you as a participant in the seminar participate or not. For instance, this was very used, the grid was a concept developed by Guattari in Laborde. And it allowed to say the silence of the catatonic participates. From the moment in which you pay attention to the fact that no one is speaking, that's not a deficit of communication. It's not a deficit of something of participation. It's something that, okay, no. Why is it that when we're discussing oil extraction, there's 200 people, you know, all the participants are fighting, and suddenly you go to finance, and the way that you position yourself is different? I don't know if it is, but at least depending on what the monitors decide to classify and how they decide to classify it, a different kind of conversation might emerge. Now we project on each conversation, then we produce a grid that we project on the wall. Second conversation, second grid. These grids remain in there. At the end of each day, we then discuss the grids. Now there are 2 approaches. The most obvious approach, and perhaps less interesting, is to discuss the content of the grid, i.e., oh, I see the frequency miraculously, people repeat a lot the word Anthropocene and technosphere. Okay, so that's not the most fantastic discovery. But actually, what is interesting is when you start discussing why did you classify in those terms? I.e., you engage into a discussion which is in itself the topic of the entire axiomatic Earth format. I.e., the mode of classification reorganizes discussions, and you end up in a kind of bit of a schizophrenic process, we hope not too out of control, discussing the mode of classification itself of your conceptual apparatus. We're not 100% sure of what's resulting from this. We hope it's productive in those terms. We have two things to say. One, within a certain context of what is the discussion of the Anthropocene nowadays, the technosphere is an amazing concept. Because it's a very simple thing that it tries to do. To say, to avoid this idea of human mastery and collaborating idea of guild process and mastery over the destruction, transformation of the Earth. The Anthropocene is not a human thing. So the technosphere, by constructing the idea of technosphere as something out of which, A, you're barely able to sense it. Let's say it's a vast, that's a different context, a large-scale machine that you don't even have the sensorial apparatus to capture its workings, let alone its own demands. So it's an autonomous machine. But at the same time, as an autonomous machine of which you're part of, means that you're being captured in a machine. In those terms, the concept is amazing for us. Now, what we try to do from the beginning is to say, A, we understand the purpose of the construction of the concept in those terms. But in our view, and the fact that most of us are practitioners of a certain kind of research, let's say, we're interested in understanding, okay, what if, for the purpose of the seminar, we avoid the technosphere as overarching concept and we think, oh, maybe there are multiple technospheres. Maybe there's not a clear-cut moment of resolution. So by introducing the axiomatic Earth framework, the framework of all of these disputes, we try to bring capitalism into the technosphere as something, and political disputes, let's say beyond capitalism, a series of political disputes that are in themselves extremely heterogeneous, extremely complicated, that one has to be very careful before one naturalizes a series of extremely violent, genocidal political disputes, because that's ultimately what the Anthropocene is. It's history. It's a history of genocide, of climatic destruction. But, environmental destruction is first and foremost, in what concerns me, a destruction of ways of living, a destruction of modes of political organization, a destruction of psychological, sociological modes of coexistence and imaginariums. So it's an extremely violent thing. So one has to be very careful, and even though understanding the nature and construction of a concept, be very careful in how one deploys it. So we recognize the qualities of the technosphere, but we say, okay, what if, let's think through a couple of days, what if there are actually not one technosphere, but multiple ones? What if then we think this in terms of multiple assemblages that in some moments interact and come together, but in which you always retract from claiming them as a single one? And let's see what comes from there.